Today on Co-op for Two, my top 15 most overlooked rules in the 7th Citadel. I don't want to give away any spoilers, so it's going to be a little difficult for me to go through these without showing you cards, but if you've already played the game and know how to play, these should make sense. Okay, my number 15 is to remember that you must declare purse cards, that's your items, before you start drawing results. This is a core rule, but it is occasionally easy to forget that certain cards are purse cards. So the items are pretty easy to remember. You must declare you're using this in an encounter before you draw results. But there are other cards that don't feel like items. They're magic spells or maybe they're companions, and you have to remember that you can't choose to use those after you start revealing the cards you've drawn. You must declare them ahead of time. Commonly overlooked rule number 14. There is something called a compound action in the 7th Citadel. Frequently this happens when you're battling some creature and it's got multiple rows, and these tend to be very difficult encounters that you probably will take several rounds to defeat. And each round you put a die and you can knock down this value by partially as you accomplish it. However, the thing that is easy to overlook is occasionally you'll get a card that doesn't really look like this. There's only one row, and it might not look like a battle. It might be some other test. And really the only sign that it's a compound action is the color of that die symbol there. And you can see normally a normal test would be this gold, and if it's compound, it's this black. So even though it's not compound, even though there aren't multiple rows, you still have to realize that this is a test that you're allowed to do multiple shots at, that it doesn't end the encounter if you don't do the full damage right away in one shot. There are a couple cards that are very easy to miss. Keep your eye open for that black background. That's your little symbol to give you a clue that you can do it partially, incrementally. Commonly overlooked rule number 13. Blocked item cards still count their weight. So if we look at an item card, a card that you're carrying around with you, a purse card, many of them have a little number indicating the weight of that item. You've got your weight limit. You can't move if you're overweight. Frequently, you'll have a card that gets exhausted, that gets blocked. You can't use it again. And normally you would take that and sort of put it out of sight somewhere, but you have to remember it's still contributing to your weight limit. It's very easy to miss this. You could always discard it to get rid of it, but as long as it's considered blocked and you're carrying it around, you still have to pay the cost in weight. That's another reason why sometimes it's useful to have a little counter somewhere to keep track of your weight, even if it's not immediately visible in your list of cards that you can use. Commonly overlooked rule number 12 is related to that, which is you'll often encounter some rule that says, hey, you might encounter someone that says, you can't do this action if you have an item with this certain keyword. And what you need to remember is that the keywords on your blocked cards are no longer operative. It's as if you didn't have a card with that keyword. It's a little confusing. It feels like it conflicts a little with the weight rule. But if a card says you can't go into this area if you've got a item with the keyword X, it doesn't matter if you do still have that item with that keyword. If it's blocked, it doesn't count and you're not affected. However, let me remind you that if you've got a card with that keyword in your purse that's not blocked, you are affected, and you cannot choose to voluntarily block that card in order to disable its keyword. You can voluntarily throw it out, but you can't voluntarily block it. Commonly overlooked confusing rule number 11 is that Hope Reborn cards, which are the upgrade cards, can be used even in the midst of reading the epilogue or the threat scenario ending preparation thing. It's very confusing because it's described as an action, and you're in the middle of reading the epilogue or the preparation phase. You're not really in the game. You can't do any of the other actions. So it is a weird, bizarre thing, and it probably could have been written better, but this is the one action you can take even when you're inside the middle of an epilogue between sentences. You can use it. Keep that in mind, and that'll be particularly useful after you finish your first scenario or the introduction, when you'll wonder, hey, should we have done this beforehand? No, you can save it, do it in the middle of the epilogue. Commonly overlooked rule number 10. Compound actions. We talked about them a little bit. Each row that you're on, you try to fight, you try to accomplish it, and you might knock it down several points. If you knock it down more, equal to or greater than the current side of the die, then you proceed to the next row. The thing that's a little bit tricky to remember is, even if you get some successes, any encounter, anytime you draw cards and resolve your successes where you don't reduce this all the way to 0, which triggers moving to the next row, even if you do most of the damage, even if you got 3 out of 4 of these successes, anytime you don't do them all, you apply the failure outcome, this black outcome. So this is not a test of whether you did any damage. This is a test of whether you did the entirety of the remainder of the damage. Only when you completely knock down the current row do you read the white success result. Commonly overlooked rule number 9. Frequently, when you start getting deep into your scenario, you'll start walking around and you'll forget the rule about walking that lets you keep a card. So typically it costs you 1 card. You draw 1 card to move 1 neighboring space. Sometimes in some areas you'll have to draw extra cards. But it is easy when you're in the flow of the game to forget that you are allowed to keep one of these cards. So every step you walk is a way to bring a card into your hand. Don't forget that. Commonly overlooked rule number 8 is something I alluded to before. You can at any time discard cards from your hand, but you can't voluntarily block cards. Sometimes the game will remind you of this because you may forget. You may reach some encounter that says, hey, if you have any of these cards, some bad thing's going to happen. Maybe if you have an item of this type, a person, all of your items you could just throw out if you need to. So if you have something you want to do, but you're carrying something that's preventing that, or carrying something that's making it more costly to do some action, remember you can throw out those cards, and that's not an action. So in the middle of a mandatory action, you could start throwing away cards from your purse, your possession, in order to reduce some consequences. Commonly overlooked rule number 7. Unblocking cards puts them into your action deck. This is a very important, subtle rule that we got wrong a couple times and can make you overpowered if you forget it. So frequently, some of the more powerful cards, after you use them, they get blocked. Okay, so you block the card. It's no longer available to use. It's not in your action deck or your discard deck. But you've got ways to unblock cards. And you might be tempted to say, okay, we're encountering something difficult, and we've got a way to unblock a card, I'm going to unblock this card and bring it into my hand. That seems logical, but that's not how it works. When you unblock a card that's been blocked so that you can reuse it again, you must shuffle it randomly back into your action deck. Makes it much harder to plan to use such a card. The only thing you could hope to try to do maybe is only bring it back when you've got a couple cards left in your action deck so you know you're going to draw it soon. But that's an easy rule to get wrong. Commonly overlooked rule number 6. Always check the max uses of certain conversions here. It's quite frequent when we were playing that we would look at something like this and say, well, I'm going to get one of these symbols that's going to account for one of the stars. And we would make our draw, and it would feel like we failed because we've forgotten, hey, we can trigger this 3 times as long as we can pay for it 3 times. And it's not uncommon to have cards that can be used multiple times and forget that you could use it multiple times. So keep an eye on those max uses, for better or worse. Commonly overlooked rule number 5. You're frequently going to be exposing cards while playing that have a red bordered action, meaning it's mandatory. You must do it right now until it ends. You can't do any other actions. And it's easy to forget that you may have cards in your hand or in your purse that let you do something, and you may forget. Your plan might have been in your mind, hey, when we need it, we'll do this thing. We'll look at the top 3 cards of the action deck, whatever. If it's an action and you've turned over a card or exposed a card or stepped on a terrain card that's got a mandatory action, then it's too late. You can no longer do this action on your card or something in a purse because you're forced to engage in a different action. You need to be thinking about that because every card you turn over could have a mandatory action. They're common. You need to be preparing to do the things that you're waiting to do and not wait until it's too late. Rule number 4, you've got weight limits. Each character has their weight limit depending on the number of players. So one player has a max weight limit they can carry of 10. If you're playing 2, it's 7 each. And you've got item cards, your purse cards, have weight associated with them. What's important to remember is that the weight limit only triggers when you want to travel from one square to another. You are allowed to be overweight until you need to move. So you may consider that you might gather some cards and prepare for some action, and you can be overweight while you do those actions on that card. You only have to discard or trade away or get rid of cards when you're overweight, when it's time to move from place to place. Rule number 3. A major new mechanic that's commonly seen on encounters in the 7th Citadel is this red chain icon. What you need to remember is that the red chain icon limits the number of cards that you check for the successes in the stars, in the gold stars. But it doesn't limit how many cards you can draw in order to choose those limited number. But even more importantly, and this is the rule that's easy to overlook, it has no bearing on the symbols you can use. So if you get a red chain 2, you could draw a huge number of cards. You're only going to be able to use the stars on 2, so maybe you pick your 2 best cards for stars. But you can use the symbols on all of these. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I have now 9 symbols. So as long as I have items and cards that use these symbols, I should be able to make this result quite powerful. And this is another strategic reason why you might look for cards in your hand, look for skills that let you to make use of symbols, because even when you're limited by a red chain, you're never limited by how many symbols you can put to use. Commonly overlooked rule number 2 has to do with repeating an action on a terrain card. Now there is a rule that says when you bring out a permanent event that's attached to a card, it'll be circled in this gold box. They call this the golden rule, that says once you've done that action, the action that brought out this card, you can't do it again. You really don't need to remember that for the most part, because that card won't be in the deck anymore. But there are a bunch of times you'll be playing where you'll look at something maybe, or you'll see a terrain card, it's got some action like scoop up something or look somewhere, and you'll do it, you'll get a card, you'll resolve that, and then you'll think, okay, that's done. You should remember though, unless it specifically is this kind of permanent event that comes out, if it's just a normal action icon on a terrain, you're not limited to how many times you can do that. The game will make it clear that a card won't be in the deck if you're not allowed to do it multiple times. But it's easy to miss that there's some little subtle times when the game expects you to maximize the benefit to do something multiple times. And finally, most commonly overlooked rule number 1, again has to do with these complicated compound actions. Most of the compound action battles, encounters you get into, will look something like this, with a red bordered fight action. That basically means you're going to have to fight this creature to the death until you complete all of the rows. There's no stopping in the middle. However, you will occasionally, especially on the harder battles, look at a compound action that looks exactly like this, except that the action, typically fight, won't be red bordered. Now that means you don't have to do that fight, you don't have to do that encounter if you don't want to, and you can partially do it and then walk away and come back. So you might have a creature you have to fight. If this wasn't red bordered, you could fight him a couple times, knock this down a couple points, and then walk away, find some items that make it easier for you to finish this encounter, and then come back and continue right where you left off. You don't even have to reset the die positions or the row. Wherever you left it, that's where you can continue. So keep your eye open for that thing. Don't assume that you have to have a battle to the death with the creature, as long as it's not red bordered. If it's red bordered, you're stuck there, battle to the death. If it's not, you can just walk right away. You don't have to engage in the fight at all, or you can start and then say, well, this isn't for me, walk away, find something to let you do it better, and then come back. There you go. So I hope you found something of interest in this list. Maybe one item that you might have overlooked will make it worth it. You might also check out my videos on top DIY upgrades for 7th, Citadel, strategy tips, or even one of our long playthroughs after you've played the game. Come back and see how we did.